In November 1943, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel arrived on the coast of France with a new mission. The Desert Fox, Germany's most celebrated commander, had been pulled from his previous assignments and given responsibility for inspecting and strengthening Hitler's Atlantic Wall, the massive defensive system designed to repel the inevitable Allied invasion of Western Europe. What Rommel discovered during his inspections horrified him. Within weeks of examining the coastal fortifications stretching from Norway to the Spanish border, he reached a stark conclusion: the Atlantic Wall would fail. This is the story of why Rommel knew the defenses couldn't hold, what he tried to do about it, and how his predictions came tragically true on the morning of June 6, 1944. The Atlantic Wall was one of Adolf Hitler's most ambitious projects. Announced with great fanfare in 1942, it was intended to be an impregnable fortress stretching over 2,400 miles along Europe's Atlantic and North Sea coastlines. Hitler envisioned thousands of concrete bunkers, gun emplacements, obstacles, mines, and fortified positions that would make any Allied landing impossible. The propaganda value was enormous. Newsreels showed massive concrete fortifications, powerful artillery batteries, and confident German soldiers manning seemingly invincible defenses. The German public was told that Fortress Europe was impregnable, that any Allied attack would be thrown back into the sea with catastrophic losses. But propaganda and reality were two very different things. By late 1943, Hitler had become increasingly concerned about the defense of Western Europe. The tide had turned against Germany on all fronts. The Soviets were advancing in the east, Italy had surrendered, and Allied bombing was devastating German cities. Hitler knew an invasion was coming. The only questions were when and where. He needed someone he could trust to assess the true state of the Atlantic Wall and prepare for the coming storm. He chose Erwin Rommel, appointing him commander of Army Group B, with responsibility for defending the coast from the Netherlands to the Loire River in France, the sector where an invasion was most likely. Rommel began his inspections in December 1943, traveling from one coastal sector to another, examining fortifications, speaking with local commanders, and assessing the readiness of the defenses. What he found shocked him to his core. The Atlantic Wall, he quickly realized, was largely a myth. Yes, there were impressive fortifications in some areas, particularly around major ports like Cherbourg, Le Havre, and Calais, but vast stretches of coastline were barely defended at all. Many of the concrete bunkers shown in propaganda films were concentrated in a few heavily fortified areas, leaving huge gaps between them. Some fortifications were incomplete, others poorly sited, and many lacked adequate garrisons or ammunition. Rommel was particularly disturbed by the beach defenses. In many sectors, there were virtually no obstacles on the beaches themselves. The German strategy had been to position defenses inland, relying on fortified positions to stop attackers after they had landed. But Rommel knew from his experience in North Africa that this approach was fatally flawed. He had witnessed firsthand the devastating power of Allied naval gunfire and air superiority. He understood that once the Allies established a beachhead, their overwhelming material superiority would make it nearly impossible to dislodge them. The only chance, Rommel believed, was to stop them on the beaches in the first few hours of the invasion before they could consolidate their position. Rommel famously declared that the war would be won or lost on the beaches in the first 24 hours of the invasion. He told his subordinates, "Believe me, the first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive. For the Allies, as well as Germany, it will be the longest day." This was not mere rhetoric. Rommel genuinely believed that if the Germans failed to throw the Allies back into the sea immediately, the invasion would succeed and Germany would lose the war. This conviction drove everything he did in the months leading up to D-Day. But why was Rommel so convinced the Atlantic Wall would fail? First and foremost was the question of Allied air and naval superiority. By 1944, the Luftwaffe had been effectively defeated over Western Europe. The Allies controlled the skies completely, flying thousands of sorties daily while German aircraft were conspicuously absent. Rommel knew that without air cover, German reinforcements and supplies would be mercilessly attacked during any daylight movement. He had experienced this himself in North Africa, where British and American fighter bombers had devastated his supply columns. In France, the situation would be even worse. The naval situation was equally dire. The German Navy's surface fleet was effectively neutralized, confined to port, or destroyed. The U-boat fleet, while still dangerous, was suffering catastrophic losses to Allied anti-submarine warfare. Meanwhile, the Allies could bring to bear the most powerful naval force ever assembled: battleships, cruisers, and destroyers capable of delivering devastating bombardments. Rommel had witnessed the power of naval gunfire in North Africa and Italy. He knew that concrete bunkers, no matter how thick their walls, could be reduced to rubble by sustained naval bombardment from heavy guns firing at close range. Rommel also understood the limitations of German manpower and resources by late 1943. The Wehrmacht was stretched desperately thin, fighting on multiple fronts. The divisions assigned to defend France were a mixed bag. Some were high-quality units, but many were undermanned, undertrained, or composed of older soldiers, teenagers, or conscripts from occupied territories with questionable loyalty. Many divisions lacked adequate transport, meaning they couldn't move quickly to counterattack an invasion. The best German divisions, including most of the panzer divisions, were held in reserve far from the coast, where they couldn't immediately respond to a landing. This brings us to one of Rommel's greatest frustrations: his ongoing conflict with his nominal superior, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the Commander-in-Chief West. Rundstedt was an old-school Prussian officer who believed in classic military doctrine: defense in depth, mobile reserves, and counterattacking once the enemy's intentions were clear. He wanted to keep the panzer divisions concentrated well inland, where they could strike the Allied beachhead after assessing where the main attack was coming. This was textbook military strategy, and Rundstedt had decades of experience to back up his approach. But Rommel vehemently disagreed. He argued that the panzers had to be positioned close to the coast, ready to counterattack within hours of a landing. He knew that in the age of Allied air supremacy, the traditional approach wouldn't work. Moving armored divisions in daylight would be suicidal. They would be spotted and destroyed by Allied fighter bombers long before reaching the battlefield. The only chance was to have them close enough to strike immediately, preferably at dawn or during bad weather, when Allied air power would be reduced. Rommel wanted the panzers positioned within a few miles of potential landing beaches, dug in and camouflaged, ready to move at a moment's notice. This fundamental disagreement created a compromise that satisfied no one. Hitler, unable to decide between his two field marshals, split the difference. Some panzer divisions were placed under Rommel's control, positioned relatively close to the coast. Others remained in a central reserve under the direct control of the German High Command, requiring Hitler's personal authorization to move. This meant that on D-Day the German response would be fatally delayed. The panzers near the coast weren't strong enough to drive back the invasion alone, and the reserve panzers couldn't be committed quickly enough to make a difference. It was, as Rommel feared, the worst of both worlds. Despite these strategic handicaps, Rommel threw himself into improving the coastal defences with characteristic energy. He embarked on a frenzy of construction and improvement that lasted from December 1943 until June 1944. His goal was to create a genuine barrier on the beaches themselves, to turn the landing zones into killing grounds where Allied soldiers would be slaughtered before they could establish a foothold. If the defences couldn't be perfect, they could at least be good enough to buy time and inflict massive casualties. Rommel ordered the placement of millions of obstacles on the beaches and in the shallow waters just offshore. These obstacles came in various types, each designed to destroy or disable landing craft. There were Belgian Gates-large steel frameworks designed to rip open the hulls of landing craft. There were Czech hedgehogs-crossed steel beams that would tear apart boats or tanks. There were wooden stakes driven into the sand, many topped with mines that would explode when struck. Rommel wanted these obstacles placed at various tide levels so that landing craft would encounter them regardless of when the invasion came. The goal was to create an impenetrable barrier that would either destroy the landing craft or force them to stop short of the beach, leaving troops to wade through deep water under withering fire. Beyond the beaches, Rommel ordered the mining of every possible landing area. Millions of mines, anti-tank and anti-personnel were laid in fields, roads, and potential drop zones. He called this the Devil's Garden, and it was intended to make movement inland nearly impossible. Rommel also ordered the flooding of low-lying areas behind the beaches, particularly in Normandy. By destroying drainage systems and damming rivers, large areas were turned into shallow lakes and marshes that would bog down attackers and channel them into prepared killing zones. These measures were particularly extensive behind Utah Beach and in areas designated for airborne landings. To counter the expected Allied use of airborne troops, Rommel ordered the installation of Rommel's asparagus millions of wooden stakes driven into fields that might serve as glider landing zones or paratrooper drop zones. Many of these stakes were connected with wire and topped with mines or shells rigged to explode. The idea was to make airborne landings catastrophic, destroying gliders and killing paratroopers before they even reached the ground. In some areas, his engineers installed hundreds of thousands of these stakes, turning promising landing fields into forests of deadly obstacles. Rommel also worked to strengthen the concrete fortifications. New bunkers were built, existing ones were reinforced, and artillery positions were improved. He wanted interlocking fields of fire, so that every stretch of beach could be covered by multiple positions. Machine gun nests were positioned to fire along the length of the beaches, creating deadly enfilade fire. Artillery was registered on potential landing zones, with pre-plotted coordinates, allowing German gunners to bring down accurate fire within seconds. Rommel understood that the first minutes of the invasion would be crucial if German defenders could inflict massive casualties immediately. Before Allied troops could organize, the invasion might stall long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Yet, even as Rommel worked frantically to improve the defenses, he knew in his heart that it wouldn't be enough. The resources weren't there. Labor was scarce, millions of workers were needed, but most able-bodied men were in uniform, and the organization TOT, responsible for military construction, was overwhelmed with projects across occupied Europe. Materials were in short supply. Concrete, steel, and mines all had to compete with other priorities: repairing bombed factories, building U-boats, producing tanks and aircraft. There was never enough of anything. Rommel's engineers worked around the clock, but progress was agonizingly slow. Time was also running out. Rommel knew the invasion would come in the spring or summer of 1944, when weather conditions would be favorable for a cross-channel operation. That gave him perhaps 6 months to complete work that should have taken years. He pushed his men relentlessly, but by June 1944, vast stretches of coastline remained inadequately defended. Of the millions of obstacles Rommel wanted placed, only a fraction had been installed. Of the millions of mines he requested, only a small percentage had been laid. The flooding program was incomplete. Many of the concrete positions lacked sufficient ammunition, and some lacked guns altogether. The Atlantic Wall remained more propaganda than reality. Rommel also faced intelligence challenges that undermined his defensive planning. The Germans knew an invasion was coming but didn't know where or when. The most obvious target was the Pas de Calais, the closest point between England and France, where the channel was narrowest. Fortifications were heaviest there, and the Germans concentrated significant forces in that sector. But Rommel couldn't rule out other possibilities: Normandy, Brittany, even the Netherlands. He had to spread his limited forces across hundreds of miles of coastline, never certain where the blow would fall. The Allies exploited this uncertainty brilliantly through Operation Fortitude, an elaborate deception campaign designed to convince the Germans that the invasion would come at Calais. Fake armies were created in southeast England, complete with dummy tanks, aircraft, and landing craft visible to German reconnaissance. False radio traffic suggested massive forces preparing to strike at Calais. The deception was so successful that even after D-Day, many German commanders, including Hitler himself, believed Normandy was a diversion and that the real invasion was still coming at Calais. This meant that powerful German forces remained tied down in the wrong place, unable to reinforce the actual battle. Rommel was not entirely fooled. He believed Normandy was a likely invasion site and pushed for stronger defences there, but he couldn't convince his superiors to shift more resources to that sector. The German High Command remained fixated on Calais, and Rommel's warnings went largely unheeded. This was yet another reason he knew the defence would fail. German intelligence had been consistently outmaneuvered, and German leadership was making decisions based on faulty assumptions and wishful thinking. By late May 1944, Rommel was exhausted and increasingly pessimistic. He had done everything humanly possible to strengthen the defences, but he knew it wasn't enough. In private conversations with subordinates, he admitted his doubts. He told his aide that if the Allies established a beachhead, the war was lost. He wrote to his wife, expressing dark forebodings about the future. Yet he continued working with manic intensity, driving himself and his men without mercy, because there was nothing else he could do. Stopping the invasion on the beaches was Germany's last hope, and he was determined to make the Allies pay the highest possible price. Ironically, Rommel was away from France on the morning of June 6, 1944, when the invasion finally came. He had returned to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday and to plead with Hitler for more resources and authority. Bad weather had convinced him and other German commanders that an invasion was unlikely in the immediate future. The weather forecast predicted storms and rough seas, conditions that would make a channel crossing extremely risky. Rommel planned to return to France on June 6, but events overtook him. The Allies had gambled on a brief window of better weather, and the gamble paid off. When news reached Rommel that the invasion had begun, he immediately rushed back to France, but it was already too late. By the time he reached his headquarters, Allied forces were ashore on 5 beaches in Normandy. The defences had fought hard casualties on some beaches, particularly Omaha, were heavy, but they hadn't stopped the invasion. The Atlantic Wall had failed, exactly as Rommel had predicted. The obstacles on the beaches had been bypassed or destroyed. Many bunkers had been knocked out by naval gunfire or isolated and bypassed. German reinforcements, moving in daylight, were savaged by Allied aircraft. The panzer divisions that might have made a difference were too far away, or required authorization that never came quickly enough. In the crucial first 24 hours that Rommel had identified as decisive, the Germans failed to drive the Allies back into the sea. By nightfall on June 6, over 150,000 Allied troops were ashore, and more were arriving every hour. The beachhead was expanding, and despite fierce German resistance, it was clear that the invasion had succeeded. Within days, the Allies had linked their beachheads and were pushing inland. Within weeks, they had captured Cherbourg and were breaking out into the French interior. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's much-vaunted fortress, had been breached in a single day. Rommel spent the following weeks trying desperately to contain the Allied advance, but it was hopeless. German forces were ground down in brutal attritional fighting. Allied air power and artillery made movement almost impossible. Reinforcements and supplies couldn't reach the front in sufficient quantities. The panzer divisions, when they finally arrived, were fed piecemeal into the battle and destroyed. Rommel could see that the situation was hopeless. Germany had lost the battle for France before it had really begun. But why, specifically, had the Atlantic Wall failed? Rommel's analysis in the days after D-Day was brutally honest. First, Allied air supremacy had been even more devastating than he had feared. German positions were bombed and strafed mercilessly. Reinforcements couldn't move in daylight. Communication lines were severed. Artillery positions were destroyed before they could inflict significant damage. The Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen. It had been swept from the skies. Without air cover, even the strongest fortifications became isolated death traps. Second, Allied naval gunfire had been overwhelming. The massive naval bombardment that preceded the landings had destroyed or suppressed many defensive positions. Bunkers that had seemed impregnable were reduced to rubble by shells from battleships and cruisers. German defenders who survived the bombardment were often too stunned and disoriented to fight effectively. The sheer volume of fire was beyond anything the Germans had experienced or prepared for. Many positions were simply obliterated before the first landing craft touched shore. Third, the compromise over tank placement had been fatal. The panzers close to the coast weren't strong enough to defeat the invasion alone. The reserve panzers were too far away and required authorization from Hitler, who was asleep when the invasion began, and couldn't be woken by his terrified staff. By the time approval came to move the reserves, Allied air power had turned the roads into killing zones. Panzer divisions that should have reached the coast in hours took days, suffering heavy losses along the way. Rommel's fear of divided command and delayed response had been realized exactly as he predicted. Fourth, the beach obstacles and defenses, while causing some casualties, hadn't been sufficient to stop the landing. Many obstacles were submerged at high tide or exposed at low tide, and the Allies had timed their landings accordingly. Specialized Allied equipment, flail tanks to detonate mines, AVREs to destroy bunkers, amphibious tanks had helped overcome many obstacles. The engineering work that Rommel had pushed so hard wasn't complete enough or extensive enough to be decisive. There simply hadn't been enough time, labor, or materials to create the impenetrable barrier he had envisioned. Fifth, German intelligence had failed catastrophically. The success of Allied deception meant that strong German forces remained tied down at Calais, waiting for an invasion that never came. Even after D-Day, Hitler remained convinced that Normandy was a feint, and he refused to release these forces for days. By the time they were finally allowed to move, it was too late. Rommel had suspected Normandy was vulnerable, but he had been overruled by commanders who believed the Allies would strike where the channel was narrowest. This fundamental misreading of Allied intentions doomed the defense from the start. Finally, there was the simple fact of Allied material superiority. The Allies brought overwhelming force to bear more troops, more ships, more aircraft, more supplies than the Germans could possibly match. The industrial might of America, combined with British resources and determination, had created a military machine that Germany, stretched thin across multiple fronts and ravaged by years of bombing, simply couldn't compete with. Rommel had known this all along. He had seen Allied material superiority in North Africa. He knew that in any sustained battle, Allied resources would prevail. The only German chance had been to win quickly, in the first hours, before Allied superiority could be brought fully to bear. That chance had been lost. In the weeks after D-Day, Rommel became increasingly convinced that Germany had lost the war and that continuing the fight was pointless. He began making contact with officers involved in the conspiracy to assassinate Hitler and overthrow the Nazi regime. Rommel didn't want to kill Hitler himself, but he came to believe that negotiating an end to the war was Germany's only hope of avoiding complete destruction. His views were known to some of the conspirators, and when their plot failed on July 20th, 1944, Rommel's name came up during interrogations. On July 17th, 1944, before the full conspiracy was uncovered, Rommel was severely wounded when his staff car was attacked by Allied fighter bombers. He suffered a fractured skull and was hospitalized out of action for the remainder of the Normandy campaign. When Hitler learned of Rommel's connection to the conspiracy, he faced a dilemma. Rommel was immensely popular with the German public and the army. A public trial would be embarrassing and potentially damaging to morale. Instead, Hitler gave Rommel a choice: face trial for treason, with the certainty of execution and disgrace for his family, or commit suicide and be given a state funeral with his family spared. On October 14, 1944, two generals arrived at Rommel's home. They presented him with Hitler's ultimatum. Rommel said goodbye to his wife and son, then left with the generals. A short distance away, he took poison and died within minutes. The Nazi regime announced that Rommel had died of his wounds from the July attack. He was given a state funeral with full military honors. The truth about his forced suicide didn't emerge until after the war. The Desert Fox, the field marshal who had known the Atlantic Wall would fail and had tried desperately to prevent that failure, was dead at age 52. The Atlantic Wall's failure had consequences far beyond D-Day itself. The successful Allied landing in Normandy opened a second front in Western Europe that Germany could not sustain. Within 3 months, France was liberated. Within 9 months, Allied armies were crossing the Rhine into Germany itself. The Atlantic Wall, which had consumed vast resources and labor, had failed to achieve its purpose. It stands as a monument to the Nazi regime's strategic failures, misplaced priorities, divided command, wishful thinking, and the belief that propaganda could substitute for reality. Today, remnants of the Atlantic Wall still dot the European coastline. Massive concrete bunkers, slowly crumbling, stand as reminders of Hitler's fortress that never was. Some have been preserved as museums or historical sites. Others are slowly disappearing, reclaimed by nature or demolished for development. They are physical evidence of a defensive system that consumed enormous resources but ultimately failed to achieve its goal. They are also a reminder of Rommel's prescient analysis. He knew the Atlantic Wall would fail. He understood why, and he was proven tragically correct. Rommel's legacy remains complex. He was a brilliant tactical commander who earned respect even from his enemies. He was also a German officer who served the Nazi regime, though he was never a Nazi Party member, and his complicity in Nazi crimes remains a subject of historical debate. His role in the July 20th plot and his ultimate fate have contributed to a somewhat sanitized image in popular culture. But his analysis of the Atlantic Wall's weaknesses and his predictions about its failure demonstrate strategic insight that his superiors lacked. He understood modern warfare better than most of his contemporaries, the importance of air power, the devastating effect of naval gunfire, the need for mobile reserves positioned close to threatened areas. The story of the Atlantic Wall is ultimately a story of strategic failure at the highest levels of German command. Hitler's insistence on defending everywhere meant defending nowhere effectively. The divided command structure prevented rapid response. The refusal to acknowledge Allied air superiority led to catastrophic miscalculations. The success of Allied deception tied down forces in the wrong place. And the fundamental underestimation of Allied capabilities meant that even the most frantic last-minute preparations couldn't compensate for years of strategic errors. Rommel saw all of this clearly. He knew the Atlantic Wall would fail because he understood the realities of modern warfare in ways that his superiors did not. He tried desperately to compensate for strategic failures through operational and tactical improvements, but he was given neither the time, resources, nor authority to succeed. His predictions came true on the morning of June 6, 1944, when Allied forces stormed ashore in Normandy and breached Hitler's vaunted fortress in a single day. The longest day, as Rommel called it, was indeed decisive, but not in Germany's favor. The Atlantic Wall had failed, the invasion had succeeded, and Nazi Germany's defeat was now inevitable. The lessons of the Atlantic Wall remain relevant. Military defenses are only as strong as the strategy behind them. Fixed fortifications cannot compensate for lost air and naval superiority. Divided command and unclear authority lead to paralysis at crucial moments. Propaganda cannot substitute for reality. And perhaps, most importantly, no defensive system, however elaborate, can succeed if the fundamental strategic situation is hopeless. Rommel understood all of this in late 1943 and early 1944. He tried to warn his superiors, tried to compensate for their errors, and tried to create at least a chance of success. But he was fighting against odds that even his considerable abilities couldn't overcome. In the end, the Atlantic Wall stands as a symbol of the Nazi regime's delusions, the belief that willpower and propaganda could overcome material reality, that ideology could substitute for sound strategy, and that defensive works alone could compensate for lost air and sea control. Rommel knew better. He knew the Atlantic Wall would fail because he understood modern warfare. He tried to prevent that failure, working himself to exhaustion in a desperate race against time. But the structural problems were too great, the resources too limited, and the strategic situation too hopeless. The Atlantic Wall failed because it was built on false premises by a regime that had lost touch with military reality. Rommel saw this truth clearly, even when his superiors refused to acknowledge it. That foresight, that understanding of what was coming, is perhaps his most significant contribution to the history of World War II. He was a prophet of defeat in a regime that refused to hear warnings, and history proved him right. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share and let us know in the comments what World War II topic you'd like us to cover next.